Our last lecture ended with, in some ways, the high point of the 3rd century crisis, and in other ways, the path forward where the Roman state could move out of this moment of political and military danger and into a new kind of political reality. So following Valerian's disastrous capture by the Persians in 260 and the revolt of the emperor, or the general and governor Postumus in the West, political life in the Roman Empire was on one level much more fragmented than it had ever been in the history of the imperial government. Gallienus, who was the son of Valerian, secured Italy, Greece, North Africa, parts of Asia Minor, and Egypt, while Palmyra controlled much of the eastern Mediterranean, from the southeastern corner of what's now Turkey all the way around eventually to the border with Egypt. And in the northwest, the regime of Postumus controlled territories from Britain to what's now France and Spain. But what's interesting about these regimes is that many have looked at this moment and seen in the division of imperial authority a sign of kind of separatism. The kind of thing that, for example, we talked about earlier, potentially afflicting people in the Eastern Mediterranean and the Greek-speaking part of the empire, and manifesting itself in, say, the great attachment to the Hellenic past in things like the Second Sophistic. But it should be very clear that's not what is going on in Palmyra or in the Northwest. These are not separatist regimes. So, for example, here are coins issued by Postumus and by Vaballathus, the son of Zenobia and Odenathus, who takes power and rules after Odenathus' death as the kind of figurehead for whom authority is being exercised by Zenobia in Palmyra. Now, these were regimes that did not cooperate with the central authorities in Rome. Palmyra effectively governed territory in what's now the Levant. Postumus and his successors effectively governed territory in the Northwest. They did not collaborate with the central authorities in Rome. And yet, if you look at these coins, what you see is these emperors, or these figures, frame themselves as Roman emperors. So you see Postumus's coin, for example, the last two letters in this, AG, suggest that he is claiming that he is an Augustus. He's claiming an imperial title. And the same is true of Vaballathus. You look at Vaballathus's coin, and the last three letters are AUG. Again, he is claiming imperial authority. They are not governing as non-Romans. They are governing as Romans. And this is especially true in the case of Palmyra, where earlier coins of Vaballathus do not even claim that he's an Augustus. They claim that he's serving as a legate of the legitimate Augustus. And those coins actually feature the emperor ruling in Rome as a figure denoted as Augustus, with Vaballathus just on the other side of the coin claiming that he's acting as the Roman legate. And so what we see here are three Roman entities: the regime of Gallienus in the center, the regime of Postumus in the northwest, and the regime of Palmyra in the east, governing Roman citizens according to Roman laws using Roman titles. We've been looking for a long time at the process of becoming Roman. And what this shows in a nutshell is that that process has succeeded. There is not space for Postumus or Vaballathus to declare themselves independent or non-Roman. This is not like, say, what happens in the Jewish revolt in the 60s AD, where the Jews declare themselves independent of Rome. This is not happening here. These are not figures who are declaring themselves independent of Rome. Instead, they realize there is no support among their citizens, who are all Roman citizens, for that kind of move. And so what they're doing is using the language of Rome, the position of Rome, the legal system of Rome, and governing as Roman sovereigns. The only difference between them and the sovereign in Italy is that they are based in a region and they are not trying to take control of the central empire. Instead, they're perfectly content governing in the region where they are based. And so what we see here is a decentralization of imperial authority, but not a breakdown in the Romanness of the population in the empire. Quite the opposite, in fact. Central authority can and does break down, but this doesn't make people less Roman. They don't rebel against Rome. They rebel against the emperor that they don't like. And so I think generally speaking, what we have to see is that these are regimes that frame themselves as Roman. And this even extends to Zenobia. So Zenobia, the queen of Palmyra, issues a coin when her son actually declares himself Augustus. And on this coin, you see her name listed, Severina Zenobia Augusta. And on the back is the image of Juno, the queen of the gods, and it says Juno Regina, Juno the queen. Now what's interesting about this is a lot of people have seen in Zenobia a kind of independent-minded, almost sort of Syrian, proto-Syrian national hero. But that's not what Zenobia is doing at all. Instead, what Zenobia is doing is copying a very long-standing way for empresses to represent themselves. So on the top of this, you see the coin of Zenobia. Below this is the coin of Selenina, the wife of Gallienus, and you can see it is the exact same iconography. There is Juno Regina and a picture of Juno with a staff and a bowl. And then going a little bit earlier in time, you see Julia Domna, the wife of Septimius Severus. Same iconography again. Juno Regina with the patera and the staff and the bird underneath. This is a way of expressing your authority as an empress. And that's what Zenobia is doing here. She is using a very specifically Roman way to talk about her position because she understands that there is no market, there is no constituency for Syrian independence. Everyone in Syria is Roman. And so if you want to rule over that region, you need to use Roman ways of expressing your power. And that's what Zenobia is doing very, very sensibly. But as we move into the 270s, the tolerance among Roman authorities for this kind of behavior really wanes. And starting in the year 270, the new emperor Aurelian takes it as his mission to reunify the empire. And so Aurelian first starts by securing his control of the Central Empire by defeating barbarian invasions. And then he makes a move to try to eliminate these two separatist empires, these two Roman states in various parts of what used to be the unified empire. So first he moves against Palmyra, then he moves against the state that Postumus had created, the Gallic Empire. But when Aurelian wins victories over these two entities, he does something very interesting. He stages a monumental triumph in the city of Rome, a massive event, where Zenobia is paraded into the city with so much gold she could barely walk on her person. The Gallic emperors Tetrarchus I and Tetrarchus II are also paraded in wearing Gallic costumes. But what Aurelian then does is he celebrates the reconciliation of the empire. And so these people are brought in, they're paraded, it's clear that symbolically their regime is over, and then Aurelian reincorporates them into the Roman state. Zenobia is allowed to marry a senator, and she lived out the rest of her life not in Palmyra, but near Hadrian's villa in the city of Tivoli. The Gallic Emperor Tetrarchus II is actually made a senator, and he lives out the rest of his life as a senator in the city of Rome. And Aurelian commemorated his reunification of the empire in a really interesting way, with a major issue of coins that framed him as the restorer of the world, the restitutor orbis. And you see on that coin the goddess Roma presiding or presenting Aurelian with a crown of victory. This was Aurelian celebrating the restoration of central control of the Roman Empire by the emperor in Italy. And this was a great victory, but not surprisingly, given the conditions in the 3rd century, it didn't last. Aurelian was assassinated in 275, not more than 2 years after celebrating this great triumph. And what we see following that is a period of, again, some relatively pronounced instability, with 2 emperors in power between 275 and 276, an emperor taking power in 276 who reigned really until the early 282, and then 3 more emperors who cycle through very quickly between 282 and 284 until this man, Diocletian, finally takes power and stabilizes the political dynamics of the state. Now, Diocletian had an innovative approach to running the empire. Diocletian was a firm and powerful figure, a really great military commander, respected greatly by his troops, but he was also somebody who learned a considerable amount of lessons from the experience of the empire in the 260s. And what Diocletian had learned was that dividing the resources of the empire and centering them on centers of power alongside the frontier, centers of power that are smaller regional groupings than the entire empire, was more efficient. It made the empire better able to respond to the problems and challenges faced by its citizens. This, Diocletian saw from the 260s, was the way the empire could both draw upon the resources of its citizens more efficiently and respond to their needs more effectively. This was, in a sense, the fulfillment of the promise that the Constitutio Antoniniana made. And so Diocletian, after less than a year in power, appointed a co-emperor named Maximian who would govern another part of the empire. But like the Antonines, Maximian was not related to Diocletian. He was from a completely different family, and he was appointed because of his capacity. And then in 293, both Diocletian and Maximian appointed a deputy emperor who would govern another sub-region of the empire on their behalf. Ultimately, this system that's put together is called by historians the Tetrarchy, and it involved 2 senior emperors, the Augusti, Diocletian and Maximian in the first iteration, each in control of a region and each with their own capital. Beneath them were the Caesars, the 2 deputy emperors, Galerius and Constantius, each again in control of a region with their own capital. And so when you break this down, it looks sort of like this. You see a division of the empire, first into west and east, and then into subregions of the west and the east, with the Augustus and the Caesar in each region taking responsibility for a different part of that territory. So, for example, the northwest of the empire, what was once the Gallic Empire of Postumus, now is part of this tetrarchic arrangement and under the control of Constantius I, the Caesar of Maximian. The Central Empire, more or less what Gallienus controlled, absent the territories in the Balkans and North Africa, this was under the control of Maximian. The Caesar under Diocletian, a man named Galerius, was based in Thessaloniki and had control of what's basically the Balkans. And then from the western part of Asia Minor through the border with Persia was the land that Diocletian was in charge of. And each of these tetrarchic figures also spent a decent amount of time in their regional capital and spent a decent amount of resources building that capital up. So in Thessaloniki, for example, the Emperor Galerius built a large complex of buildings along the Via Egnatia, the main road linking the Adriatic and the Bosporus. And in this, there is Galerius's mausoleum and also a triumphal arch that celebrates Galerius's great victory that he would win over the Persians. In 306, the next phase in the tetrarchic arrangement is undertaken. So the idea of the Tetrarchy was, of course, to create a structure so that the regional resiliency that one sees in the Gallic Empire and in the Palmyrene Empire is preserved, but also grouped under the central authority of the Roman state. And the Tetrarchy creates that ability to both respond dynamically and quickly to regional concerns, and also keep the people who are doing that response plugged into a larger imperial structure. And so that solves one 3rd century problem. But the other 3rd century problem that the Tetrarchy tries to address is the question of who will be emperor and who has the authority to decide this. For much of the 3rd century, there had been a great deal of controversy and strife about whether the army or the Senate should have the responsibility and the privilege of choosing the emperor. And you see a back and forth between military and senatorial figures for a lot of the sort of civil conflicts of the 3rd century. What Diocletian decided to do was instead to create a structure that appointed these deputy emperors, these Caesars, and made it clear that they were next in line for the imperial succession. And they would take power when the senior emperors reached a term limit of 20 years. At that point, the senior emperors would retire, the junior emperors would step up and become senior emperors, and new emperors would be appointed. And so this idea of a kind of succession arrangement that leads to a regular circulation of people through junior and senior emperorships was particularly appealing because it excluded the ability of both the Senate and the army to do these kind of ad hoc decision-making processes where they would overthrow emperors that they didn't like. Now, if somebody managed to overthrow one of the tetrarchic emperors, they could expect to be met with the overwhelming force of the other 3 tetrarchs. So in principle, this seems to be a revolutionary way to deal with a lot of the problems that Diocletian inherited from the 3rd century crisis. But there are also implications for the larger way the empire worked. The Senate, which had been the locus of the elite representation and engagement with the emperor, it still remained in the city of Rome. But Rome was no longer the residence of the emperors. Emperors occasionally visited the city, but for the most part, they were in their provincial capitals, places like Galerius's Thessaloniki, or they were on campaign along the frontiers. And so imperial capitals in the provinces, these kind of regional centers like Thessaloniki, became increasingly important. And these provincial cities, not the city of Rome, now became the beneficiaries of a large amount of imperial spending and construction. So things like, again, the complex of buildings that Galerius built in Thessaloniki. This is an interior view of that building. Diocletian also took steps to abolish some of the special positioning that Italy had enjoyed since the days of the Roman Republic. So from the time of the Roman Republic, Italians had been exempt from taxation. This is something that Diocletian does away with. Diocletian also reworked the provincial boundaries of the empire so that instead of 60 relatively large boundaries, again, I mean, the Roman Empire that Diocletian ruled over was roughly the size of the United States, a little bit bigger actually, and it had 60 different provinces. That means the provinces are roughly the size of US states. And that doesn't really work in a world where communication is, based on how quickly someone can carry a message to somebody else. Smaller is better in that context, especially when government needs to respond to needs. And so what Diocletian does is he removes the special statuses of provinces like Italy and Egypt, and he uniformly imposes a structure where all provinces are equal, and then the provinces are redesigned so that they can be more efficiently administered. As Diocletian works through the creation and structuring of the Tetrarchy, what we see is Diocletian leans into this idea that all tetrarchs are equally authoritative. Now, early in Diocletian's reign, his portraiture is very individualized. You could imagine meeting somebody who looks like this. As you move through Diocletian's reign, though, the portraiture becomes more and more less and less realistic and more sort of stylized. And so what you see is eventually, once the Tetrarchy is formed in the 290s, the images of the emperors are designed and portrayed so that the emperors are identical to one another. So these are two representations of the tetrarchs. One of them is a famous representation in a particularly hard purple stone called porphyry, and this shows Galerius and Diocletian embracing and Constantius and Maximian embracing. You can't tell who's who, and that's by design. This other image, this coin that celebrates the virtue of the armies, this shows all four tetrarchs standing around an altar sacrificing together. And again, it's impossible to identify who is who. And again, that's by design. You are supposed to see in the Tetrarchy a unit, and each individual tetrarch is a component of that unit. But the authority in the empire rests with that unit. And you may have a component of that unit near to you, but that person is not greater or less than their role as a component in this imperial structure. But at the same time this is set up, and this idea that the tetrarchs are brothers, they are unified, they are in a sense almost interchangeable, a real attempt is also made to say that these four people may be similar to each other, but they are very different from everyone else. And so in their propaganda, the tetrarchs emphasize the fact that they are communicating with the divinities and actually, in some ways, almost are divinities. And so you see, for example, Diocletian representing himself as an imperial figure, but also interacting on the reverse of the coin with a divinity. This is not just an iconographic step, though. It's not just the emperors present themselves as divine figures. They also very clearly wanted to distinguish themselves in a very physical and clear way from everybody else. So, for example, they became very interested in creating ceremonies that indicated the subservience of the people to them, ceremonies that involved bowing and positioning the emperor far above anyone else. And this is very different from the idea that Augustus had. The Augustan Empire and the ideal of the empire all the way through the 3rd century was that the emperor is, in essence, the first among equals. He is the first citizen, but he is still a citizen, and he is still in many ways bound by a relationship that is on some level a mutual relationship. This is not what the tetrarchs were about. Instead, they were different. They were markedly different. They wanted you to understand they were different. They sat in different ways. They differentiated themselves from people in society. They even wore different kinds of clothes. And so, for example, emperors became very protective of their exclusive prerogative to wear clothes made with a specific type of purple dye. And so a law shows this. This is a later law than the Tetrarchy, but it shows the basic principle. It says that all persons of whatever sex, rank, skill, profession, or family shall abstain from the possession of that kind of material which is dedicated only to the emperor and to his household. Nor shall any person at his home weave or make silk cloaks or tunics that have been colored with purple dye. So, on one level, to us, this looks ridiculous. Why does anyone care if someone who's not the emperor wears purple? But this mattered greatly to the emperors. So greatly, in fact, that they took over and monopolized the manufacture of purple dye. They actually took over the towns where the shellfish, and it's called the murex. This shows you the shellfish and the type of dye that they produce. The murex could only be farmed in certain areas. And starting under Diocletian, the people who lived in those areas became virtual indentured servants to a purple industry dominated by the emperors. They were not allowed to leave. They were not allowed to move to other places. They were not allowed to start other professions. Instead, they farmed these shellfish. And the dye they produced was exclusively the preserve of the emperors. And this purple was not just something they wore in their clothes. This is also, of course, why they use purple stone. So porphyry, and you can see here the material that the Tetrarchy statue, the Venice Tetrarchs, is made out of. This was a material that the emperors, from the 3rd century on, reserved only for their use. So if you go to Istanbul now and you go to the Istanbul Archaeological Museum, you walk around the courtyard and you see all of these sarcophagi made out of purple. Those are imperial sarcophagi. And we know that because anything made out of porphyry must be imperial. There is no one else who's allowed to use that material for that kind of purpose. And finally, this visual distinction was something that corresponded also to the titles they used. So this is Diocletian's name. Just that. This full 18-line long title is just his name. And the importance of this, I think, should be clear. This is another way of distinguishing Diocletian from a regular person. A regular person doesn't have all of these different titles and all of these different ways of describing himself. This is a way for Diocletian to indicate that he is different, that he exists on a different plane of reality. And this is why a lot of people and a lot of historians look at the transition of the empire under Diocletian as something that does away with what was called the Principate, this idea of the emperor as a first citizen, and installs this idea of the dominant, the emperor as a lord. And that's what Diocletian is doing here. He's asserting his prerogative to be distinctive, to not be the first citizen of the Roman state, but to be the lord of the Roman state. Now, to make all of this work, Diocletian brought an incredible administrative talent to the Roman state. This is a map of the provinces and the restructuring that Diocletian undertook. What you see here are all the provinces. These are the areas in pink that have the all-cap titles. So Germania II, Belgica II, Flaminia and Picenum, Dalmatia, Proconsularis, Byzica. I mean, these are all areas that are provinces. And then in the red, you see these places that are marked as dioceses. This is an additional administrative structure that Diocletian created. So there are provinces, and these provinces are numerous. They are grouped around administrative units, and they're designed so that the resources of that region can be better gathered into imperial control, and the needs of that region can be better responded to by emperors. But then these dioceses are larger groupings of provinces. And this makes it easier to tackle large scale or larger scale problems. Not problems that are empire-wide problems, but problems that are more pronounced than things that just afflict an individual province. And so what Diocletian is doing is creating a much more robust regional authority structure. And it requires people to do this. When this structure is fully built out by the Emperor Constantine, there are probably 50,000 people required to work as civil servants to maintain this structure. But the structure does a lot that's good. It does improve what the state can do. It does improve the state's ability to respond to conditions in regional areas. And that's popular. But one thing that's not popular is, of course, when you expand what the state can do, you also require more resources. And so Diocletian and his colleagues instituted a taxation reform that created a new and flexible system of taxation called the Coinage System, which said that every 15 years, beginning every 5 years in 293, but afterwards every 15 years, a group of tax assessors traveled around the entire empire to judge how productive each piece of land was. And they then would assess tax based on the productivity of that land. And so a mountainous piece of land would be taxed far less than land in a floodplain. But what this also meant was if, say, there was a flood on your land in the floodplain and all of your agricultural infrastructure was destroyed, the tax assessor could come and say, this land was once more productive, so we need to cut the taxes on this land because it simply is not possible to pay the taxes at the level that was once something that the owner could bear. And so every 5 to 15 years, these indictions occurred that reassessed the taxes for everybody across the empire. Now, this was also accompanied by a currency reform. The Emperor Aurelian, in one of the less well thought out reforms that Aurelian undertook, scrapped the old system of coinage that the empire had used, created something completely new, and sparked a radical rise in inflation across the empire. And what the Tetrarchs realized is they needed to find a way to stabilize the currency. And so to do this, they created an entirely new coinage system again. This would be a system that would be based on a gold coin, eventually called the solidus, a silver coin called the argenteus, and then a series of bronze coins, one of which was dipped in silver, and then others that didn't have much silver content at all. And the idea was this gave you a high value coin in the gold, a medium value coin in the silver, and then a series of coins with lesser value that would be fractions of those larger coins. It was an attempt to reinstitute the monetary system that had existed since the time of Augustus, a monetary system that had everything from small change all the way up to high value gold coins, and a system that existed with predictable processes of exchange moving between those coins. And so you always knew in the old system what a bronze coin, how many bronze coins of a certain valuation was needed to buy a silver coin or a gold coin. And Diocletian and the Tetrarchs tried to set something else up like this. And they were responding to a real problem. The reality was prices in the 3rd century skyrocketed, overwhelmingly because of the monetary reform that failed that Aurelian had introduced. And what you see is a standard pattern of inflation, but then by the end of this period, by the end of the 3rd century, you even are beyond this standard pattern of inflation, and you enter an era of almost hyperinflation. And so what we need to do and what we need to understand is why this is a problem for emperors. Much of the accounting done by the imperial government didn't involve actually coins. It involved kind of notional accounting units. But there were people who required payment by coin on a regular basis. And these people are important because these people are soldiers. And so the coins needed to have a defined value for the payments given to soldiers to actually be meaningful, to actually have a monetary value that soldiers thought was worth their time, and to keep the soldiers happy enough to not rebel. There's another problem with this kind of inflation, though. As coinage changes, people who become aware of this change in advance can do things to kind of hedge their losses. So, for example, in the 310s, there is a devaluation of the coinage that Diocletian had created. And you see in this papyrus, someone knew about it before it would be announced. And so this is a letter that's addressed to Egypt, where the letter says, "The divine fortune of the masters have given orders that the Italian coinage be reduced to half a numis. Make haste, therefore, to spend all the Italian money you have, and purchase for me all kinds of goods at whatever price you find them. But I tell you in advance, if you try any shenanigans, I won't let you get away with it. I pray you continue in good health." So this is a patron basically writing to someone working under him, telling him to spend all of the cash money that he has, buy whatever he can, and hold on to those goods because there's about to be a devaluation. And when that devaluation occurs, the money will just be worth half as much as it had been before. Now, this inflation problem is something that Diocletian was acutely aware of. And as you can see, it's not something that Diocletian manages to solve. But what Diocletian does understand is that for the currency to stabilize, there has to be a complete system where it's possible to move from small change all the way to a high value gold coin, and this has to be predictable. And so Diocletian, by creating this system, understands the need to create a predictable monetary system as a hedge against this kind of inflation. The problem that Diocletian faces, though, is once this system comes under pressure, he doesn't understand how to fight that pressure off, how to stabilize it. Because the gold coinage and even the silver coinage held its value, but the value of the bronze coinage quickly slipped away. Because these bronze coins that included 5% silver as a sort of covering, these bronze coins quickly had people take the silver off, melt the silver off of the coin, create kind of silver bars, and try to spend the coin without silver as a bronze coin. And the value of that coin was not clear. And so the system began to collapse. And as Diocletian saw the system collapsing, he understood that the collapse of this system and the return of this kind of hyperinflation would be a huge problem for his soldiers, the people who were being paid in this coinage. And so Diocletian responded as somebody with the autocratic tendencies of somebody like Diocletian would. He and the Tetrarchs issued a law that said, there will now be maximum prices set for everything. The law reads like this. It is the only desire of unrestrained madness to care nothing for the common need, and since it's considered among the unscrupulous and intemperate almost the creed of avarice to desist from ravaging the wealth of all through a necessity rather than its own wish, we, the protectors of the human race, viewing the situation, have agreed that justice must intervene as arbiter, so that the long hoped-for solution which mankind itself could not supply might through the remedy of our foresight be applied for the good of all. And concern for humanity in general persuades us to set a limit, our subjects, to the avarice of such men. So Diocletian sees inflation hitting the empire. And instead of understanding the complicated causes for this, what Diocletian immediately does is he singles out the greed of individuals who are sweating the silver off of these bronze coins and destabilizing the monetary system and then charging more money for things because the coins are no longer worth what they used to be worth. So to combat that, Diocletian simply says, we're not going to allow you to charge more money for things. But the reason why this is important, Diocletian also makes clear. He says that everybody knows that this insolence covertly attacks the Republic. And wherever the public safety demands that our armies be directed, not in villages or towns only, but on every road, it comes to the mind of the profiteer to extort prices for merchandise, not fourfold or eightfold, but such that human speech is incapable of describing either the price or the act, and that sometimes the single purchase of a soldier deprives him of his bonus and his salary, so that the contributions of the whole world to support our armies fall to the abominable profit of thieves. And so this lays out what Diocletian's real concern is. The army is being paid in this new coinage. And it's being paid in this new coinage in a fashion that does not take into account the artificial inflation that's happening in the marketplace. And so the soldiers are paid and they go to spend the money, and the money is not worth what it should be. And this to Diocletian and the other tetrarchs is a security threat, because the armies are being affected by inflation. And the armies are the ones, especially the regular soldiers, are the ones who are bearing the burden of this coinage that does not retain its value. And so the Tetrarchic's response is to decree that there be established not prices for articles of sale, because such an act would be unjust when sometimes there is the good fortune and low prices that come about, but a maximum price, so that greed might be checked by the limits of our statute. And so what Diocletian says is, we're not setting prices. Prices can fluctuate as the market dictates, but these people who are going to spur inflation by charging more than they should, and by asking for coins that are worth less than they actually should be worth, these people will no longer be allowed to do this, because the charges that they the way that they price their goods cannot go above an absolute maximum price. And to go on, Diocletian and his colleagues say, anyone who violates this should be subject to capital punishment. And anyone who conspires against this law with the greed of the seller, i.e. someone who pays prices that are beyond the maximum, they also should be killed. Now this seems absurd, right? We did have in the United States, for example, in the early 1970s, a set of price controls instituted by Richard Nixon, but the death penalty did not go along with the violation of these rules. What Diocletian here is doing is using the fear of punishment as a way to break the assumption of inflation. Now, we might look at this and say this is ridiculous, and on one level it is. I mean, measures like this are really, really difficult, and they don't work in the long term. But we also have to understand Diocletian is not providing a long-term solution to this. He feels like the currency reform is the long-term solution to this. What he's trying to do is to stabilize the currency in such a way that gradually people become accustomed to the value the currency is stated to have, and the pricing then works in such a way that it is relatively stable because it reflects the understood value of the coins people are using to purchase something. And so Diocletian is not using the idea of a maximum price edict to set prices forever. What he's trying to do is to break the inflationary expectation that people have. This idea that coins will always be worth less, prices will always go up, and this assumption, once it becomes pervasive, is something that is always there. And what Diocletian and his colleagues are trying to do is destroy that assumption and combat inflation by destroying the mentality that fuels it. The interesting thing is it works in the short term. We see that people selling things in marketplaces do actually have their purchase prices sanctioned by the people who manage the marketplace, and the sanctioned prices are consistent with the Edict of Maximum Price, and they also certify by oath that they are going to adhere to the terms of the Maximum Price Edict, and they're not going to informally do anything that says the price is one thing, but the price they actually take is much higher. And so what we see is the state actually has a remarkable capacity to do things. It has a capacity to reform the way the state works. It has a capacity to reform the tax system. It has a capacity to reform the monetary system. It even has the capacity to work against these inflationary assumptions. But to conclude our discussion of Diocletian, it's important to talk about one aspect where the power and this robust power of this new and reformed state is used in a very clearly and unquestionably negative fashion. And this is with Christian persecutions. Now, in our last lecture, we talked about the role of Christians and the place of Christians in Roman society. And we talked about how for much of Roman history, Christians could be persecuted, but largely were not. You would have to really do something to come to the attention of a governor who really wanted or felt the need to persecute you to actually die in a persecution. But there is a spurt of time in the 250s when Christian persecution is real, it's centralized, and large numbers of Christians across the empire are arrested and punished. But we also talked about what happened to the two emperors who do this. Of course, Decius dies at the hands of the Goths, and Valerian is captured and dies as a captive in the Persian Empire. And after this, there is a walking away from persecution. And for nearly 40 years, the church enjoys something that's called the little peace of the church, a period when Christianity is tolerated, the open profession of Christianity, the building of churches. All of these things are things that can happen and do happen in the cities of the empire. But this ends with Diocletian. It ends with what's called the Great Persecution, a persecution begun by the Tetrarchs that continues off and on for the better part of almost 10 years. Now, we have a story of how the persecution is set off. It's told by a man named Lactantius, someone who was a Christian who was prominent at the court of Diocletian, and later it seems was prominent at the court of Constantine. And Lactantius tells us that the persecution started because Diocletian, who was of timorous disposition, meaning he's kind of a worrywart, was eager to look into the future. And during his time in the East, he began to slay victims so that from their livers he might obtain a prognostication. He might obtain a prediction of future events. And while he sacrificed, some attendants of his who were Christians stood by, and they made the sign of the cross, the immortal sign, on their foreheads. And at this, the gods, the demons, were chased away, and the holy rites were interrupted. When they heard about this, or when they saw this, the soothsayers who were handling this sacrifice and trying to get a sense of what the God's will was, they trembled because they were unable to investigate the marks on the entrails of the sacrificial victims. And they frequently repeated the sacrifices, but the victims afforded no tokens for divination. And at length, the chief of the soothsayers, either from a guess or from his own observation, said, "There are profane people here who obscure the rites." And Diocletian, in furious passion, ordered not only those who were assisting at the ceremonies, but those who resided within the palace to sacrifice, and if they refused to do it, they would be scourged. And so what Lactantius is saying is the Christian persecution begins because Diocletian is trying to perform pagan rituals, and Christians were actually trying to be helpful, make the sign of the cross a expression of their devotion to their God on behalf of the emperor. And this is not really misunderstood, but it's taken as a sign that these people are disloyal, and Diocletian then gets angry at the disruption of the holy rites because the invocation of the Christian God prevents the pagan gods from offering the visions of the future that Diocletian wants. And so Diocletian then orders everybody who is in the palace to sacrifice, and if they won't do it, they should be scourged, a way of singling out the Christians in the palace so that they either sacrifice and stop obstructing the pagan gods, or basically are punished. What came next was a decision to extend this beyond the palace. And so when the next day dawned, in the 8th consulship of Diocletian and the 7th of Maximian, suddenly, while it was barely light, the prefects, together with the chief commanders, tribunes, and officers of the treasury, came to the church in Nicomedia and forced the gates open, and everywhere searched for an image of the divinity. The books of the Holy Scriptures were found, and they were committed to flames. The utensils and furniture of the church were abandoned. All was rapine, confusion, and tumult. That church, situated on rising ground, was within view of the palace, and Diocletian and Galerius stood as if on a watchtower, disputing long whether they should burn the church down. Now, the persecution begins with the nailing of an order of persecution in a public square in the city of Nicomedia, where Diocletian and Galerius were. We're told that as soon as this goes up, a Christian in the crowd runs up and tears it down and calls out that this is going to make Galerius and Diocletian suffer the same kind of fate as Decius and Valerian, and he's promptly arrested and killed. Then the next phase is the attack on the churches. The church doors are pulled open, and then agents of the state go in, take the Holy Scriptures, they burn them, and then they take the treasures in the church. And these treasures are significant, right? 40 years of peace of the church has meant that the churches now are relatively wealthy, certainly wealthier than they were in the 250s. And so the property of the church is seized, and the church, Diocletian and Galerius, decide whether it should be burned down or not. The persecution then spreads around the empire. So we see in 304, for example, in the 9th consulship of the Emperor Diocletian and the 8th of our Lord Maximian Augustus, to the officials of the glorious city of Oxyrhynchus, from Aurelius Ammonius, son of Copras, lector of the formerly established church of the village of Chaisis. When you gave me orders in accordance with the communication from Aurelius Athanasius, the procurator of the imperial property, concerning the surrender of all goods in the church, and whereas I submitted that the church had neither gold nor silver nor money, nor vestments, nor animals, nor slaves, nor land, nor property or gifts from testamentary bequests. Now what this represents is a person from the church in Oxyrhynchus writing to an imperial official and saying, I understand that you have asked to take over all of the property of the church, but we have no property. And this is an extension of the same thing that you see in Nicomedia. In Nicomedia, of course, the persecution begins by agents of the imperial government going into the church in Nicomedia and seizing its property. And that property, once it's seized, goes to the official personal account of the emperor. And this then spreads around the empire. And so in Oxyrhynchus, we see the same thing happening. The church in Oxyrhynchus is asked to surrender all its property to the person who administers the imperial personal property in Egypt, a man named Aurelius Athanasius. And this person who works for the church, the lector of the church in Oxyrhynchus, says, we don't have any property. This shows the extent of the persecution and how quickly it flows out. By the next year, you have evidence that church property is being taken across the empire. But this is not just church property. The persecution attacks also church leaders. Now, it's clear from our sources that Diocletian and his colleagues are not interested in arresting and killing every Christian in the empire. The Christian community is much larger at this point. It's possibly as much as 10% of the Roman population, and the state has no interest in taking all of those people and killing them, nor does it really have the capacity to do it. But what the persecution under Diocletian does is it uses the resources of the state to identify Christian leaders, bishops, and it arrests, imprisons, and sometimes kills those bishops, and it attacks church property. And it does have the capacity to do both of those things. And so when we see the persecution, the great persecution of Christians under Diocletian, a few things are clear. First of all, this is an emperor and his colleagues who have become very accustomed to the state being capable, the state having a reach that extends all the way across the empire through these dioceses and these provincial governorships and through these regional capitals. The emperors now have a much better ability to center in on what is going on in each of the towns, cities, and localities in their empire. They have also the capacity, when they choose to do it, to move against something like the Christian church on an empire-wide level. And this is something that Decius and Valerian did not possess. And so the attacks on the church done by Diocletian and his colleagues in the early part of the 4th century are significant in a way that those earlier attacks were not. Lots of Christians die in the Great Persecution, but it's important to also understand, and we have sources that talk about this, the emperors and imperial officials are not interested in killing all Christians. The life of Antony, for example, talks about the ascetic, the first monk in the Christian tradition, a man named Antony, coming into a courtroom in Egypt where a trial of a Christian is taking place. And Antony interrupts the trial and says, I'm a Christian. And the judge looks at him and says, in essence, but you're not important. And so Christians did die in the Great Persecution. Large numbers of them did. But all Christians did not. And in fact, the emperors have no interest in killing all Christians. What they want to do is destroy the church by lopping off its head, by taking out its leadership and then destroying or confiscating all of the property that could make the church continue to function. And this is a really significant problem for Christian communities. But it's also, in some ways, a new way for the Roman state to behave. Because it's only now, with all of the reforms of Diocletian and his colleagues, that the Roman state has the capacity to do what it does in the Great Persecution.